Good morning and welcome to Class 3 of Psych 250 for the Summer 2017 session at NDSU. I'm really excited about today's lecture. It's one of my favorites. I love talking about diversity. I love talking about ethics. This content is not in your book. And so it's very important that you watch this lecture if you don't watch any other, because you won't get this information just by reading the book. Today's class will cover a variety of topics related to diversity and ethics. We'll go through some case examples. We'll talk about current events and how those current events could affect a person's development. A lot of the information that we'll talk about will come up again. This is just intended to be an introduction for you to this content, so that you are aware of how diverse perspectives, how minorities, how marginalized communities are affected by the way that we do research, by the way that we treat them as a society, and how that can potentially affect their outcomes. So it's important for us to have this conversation. Now, I understand that for some people, some of the things we're talking about today may be upsetting. I get it. And we're going to, it's hard to do this online because I can't be with you to gauge where you are. So I want to keep the line of communication open. I want to make sure that you have the support that you need. So if you are experiencing any kind of distress or you're upset and you need to talk about what happened or what we're talking, not what happened, but talk about what we're talking about in class today, please contact me. You can do so by emailing me, darcy.corbetthall@ndsu.edu. You can also call my office, 701-630-6838, and we can talk about it. I don't want you to feel like you're being exposed to some things that are really upsetting and don't have the outlet to talk about it. If you don't want to talk to me about it, you can call the counseling center on campus, 701-231-7671. They're available 24/7. They also have walk-in appointments available, or you can call the national hotline at 1-800-273-TALK 8255, 1-800-273-8255. Let's get started. So, when we talk about people groups, we can categorize them in many different ways. And one of the main ways that we categorize people is their ethnicity. Now, we often, when we talk about ethnicity, we think about race. And race is a social classification based on skin color and physical features. And we hear people talk about this all the time, our racial identity. What race are you? Every time we fill out a demographics form, people ask about our race. The reality is that race is not based on biology or scientific classification. It's actually, it's a cultural construct. It's something that we've come up with as a society. And unfortunately, if you look at the history of race and when we started to use racially charged language and racial categorization, it was invented to justify white supremacy and to justify slavery. In other words, if we can classify people based on the way that they look and the color of their skin, then we can create these social hierarchies where some people are more important than others. And so examples of races are Caucasian, which comes from Caucasoid. These are people who are white and have sort of white structures. Negroid, or we would say black now, but Negroid was the category for people from Africa. Mongoloid were people from Asia, and there are others. And it was invented not by anyone with a degree in biology. It was actually an anthropological invention, and unfortunately it just it's not accurate. It's based on appearances. It's not based on anything other than that, and so that becomes a problem. It becomes really problematic. And so for the purposes of this class, we're not going to be talking so much about race when we in terms of our discussion of people and their identities. We'll talk about race in terms of the way that they're treated and the way that they experience life. But if we're going to categorize people by identity, we're going to talk about ethnicity. And ethnicity is a social group formed of similar national or cultural identities. And ethnicity is, unlike race, is self-defined. It's not based on the color of your skin, the way that you look. It's based on where you come from and what culture you identify with. And so it spans skin color, it spans genetic information. And examples would be European, Latino or Latina or Latinx, Arab or Native American. Those are some categories. African could be a category. Um, Person of African descent. Um, Ethnicity it's not it's still problematic in some ways, but it doesn't have the same history of oppression that race does. Because it is self-defined, we are able to identify what ethnicity or what ethnic group we belong to. And so in this class, we'll talk about ethnicity. When it comes to race, actually, I'm sorry, we're going to talk about gender next. Sorry. Gender. So let's talk about gender. Gender is a socially constructed set of roles, behaviors, and traits that are associated with specific biological sexes but not bound to them. In other words, in our society, it's very common for us to use sex and gender interchangeably, but actually they're not the same thing. Gender is a social performance. It's a costume that we wear that defines the behaviors that we do, it defines the interactions that we have, and in some regards, it defines the value that we have in society. Because we unfortunately live in a society where men are much more valued than women, and the contributions of men are given much more uh, uh, weight than the contributions of women. And so our gender is not something that is inherent within us. It's just something that happens to us, that is assigned to us in many different ways. However, the brain doesn't always agree with society's assignment of gender. And our own internal sense, our own constant individual sense of belonging or associating with gender traits or behaviors is called our gender identity. So everyone watching this has a gender identity. I don't know if you knew it or not, but you do. That is just our brain saying, okay, I identify with being a man or I identify with being a woman, or I don't identify with either of those. Um, so our gender identity is completely determined by the individual. It's not determined by our body parts. It's not determined by our chromosomes. It's not determined by what society tells us or defines us as. It's completely defined by how our brain elects to identify ourselves. There are two main categories of gender identity: cisgender, cis from the Latin word on the same side. Um, this is an association with the gender assumed by your sex assigned at birth. So you are identified by the doctor as being a male or a female, and you identify, in your mind, you identify with being a man or a woman. Um, I imagine that most people watching this are cisgender. Transgender, so I'm transgender, I mentioned that last time. This is the association with the gender opposite that assumed by your sex assigned at birth. So, in other words, you are born, the doctor says that you're male, but your brain says, no, I don't really feel like I'm male, I feel like I'm a woman. And I'm going to identify that way because that's how I feel comfortable and that's how I feel I best am defined. That is what transgender is. And so there are many different, much more different types, much more diverse types of transgender identity. Man, transgender woman, genderqueer. These are people who don't really abide by any kind of strict binary-based gender norms. Agender, so identification with no gender norms. Bigender, identification simultaneously with both the man and woman gender, and more. There are many more classifications, and we'll talk more about gender identity in the weeks to come. Sex, unlike gender, is biological. It's something that we have very little control over. I mean, you can alter sex, it's not impossible. Um, but it's a biological categorization that's based on perceptions of genitalia composition. In other words, what happens is you're born, and I don't know if you've ever seen a baby when it's born, but there's not a huge difference in the genitalia. And there's some differences, like some clear differences, but for the most part, it's all kind of flat down there. And so, um, you're born, the doctor looks, and based on the length of your of your penis, essentially, decides if you're male, female, or intersex. And so they decide what you're going to be, and then they write it on your birth certificate, and that is what your sex is. Um, so, for example, male is a sex, and that's having the typical male reproductive capability, so having testes and a scrotum. Female is having a typical female reproductive structure, such as ovaries, uterus, and vagina. And then intersex, which is something that a lot of people are not familiar with, but this is having atypical reproductive structures. Some people think of intersex or they are called sometimes hermaphrodite, which is not an appropriate word. It's offensive, shouldn't use it, but I'm just using it here to maybe contextualize this for people. But intersex people a lot of times are categorized as people who have both a penis and a vagina, and that's not true necessarily. What happens when you're intersex is that when it comes to identifying your genitalia, there's a lot of ambiguity. You don't necessarily meet the what we would think of as the typical male or typical female genitalia. And so it's atypical. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just not what we would expect to see. And usually what happens, and it's kind of unfortunate, but what usually happens is the doctor and the parents make a decision. That's not considered to be ethical anymore, but it's still practiced throughout the world and in the United States even. Um, but there are actually quite a few gender or intersex people alive, and about 10% of the population is estimated to be intersex, so it's a fairly sizable number. As I mentioned before, your sex assigned at birth does not determine your gender identity. It is pure, it's just all it defines is how you reproduce. And sex is determined by your chromosomes to a degree, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the semester. But for the most part, sex is only a classification of how you reproduce in terms of what you contribute to the reproductive cycle. Related to sex is our sexuality, and this is our internal sense of being attracted to specific sexes, genders, or individuals. And so sexuality can be very fluid or flexible over time, especially when it comes to women. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about sexuality when we get to the adolescent section of the class. Um, it's also a normal component of development, and it is the result of both our biological nature as well as the environment in which we grow up in. And so when you reach puberty, it is very normal for you to start to be attracted to either members of the same sex or opposite sex or both. And it just really depends on who you are. It depends on how you grew up. It depends on the composition of your brain and your hormonal structures. It's all natural for the individual and normal for them. So there's not really a normal or default sexuality. It just depends on the person. Here are just a few of the types of sexualities that exist, and we'll talk more about this, like I said, as we progress in the semester. Asexual is one, or ace. This is low or non-existent sexual attraction. So you can have zero sexual attraction, you could have some sexual attraction, but it could be limited to like having a deep romantic connection first. You could have some sexual attraction, but it's like very limited in terms of the type of contact or type of attraction. Bisexual or bi, this is sexual attraction to both sexes. Gay or lesbian is sexual attraction to the same sex. The next, nobody understands this. Nobody knows or gets straight. But straight, just to let you know, is sexual attraction to the opposite sex. I'm kidding. I'm sure everyone in here gets straight. Sexual attraction to the opposite sex. Pansexual or pan, this is sexual attraction to individuals regardless of their sex or gender. And then queer is a term that means self-defined sexuality. So queer has been used as a pejorative or as a bad word to discriminate against LGBT people, but the community is taking it back. And so you'll hear people define themselves as queer, and usually they do so because they don't feel like any of the labels really define who they are, and queer is just a good sort of catch-all term that can describe that they are different than what is considered normal, but that they're okay with it. So why is it important to consider diversity? Why are we talking about diversity? Well, here's why. When we don't consider diversity in our classes and our discussion and our research, entire groups of people go unnoticed. And when we stop noticing people when they're erased, we subconsciously begin to devalue them as human beings. We dehumanize them. And the result is that people groups are oppressed and their development is negatively affected. And if that wasn't bad enough, often dehumanization of people groups leads to atrocities such as genocide and unethical experiments. And it's not just the minority group or the marginalized group that suffers. Everyone suffers. We as a culture suffer. Germany, a country that committed atrocities only a short time ago, slaughtered millions of people, millions of Jews, millions of LGBT people, millions of people with intellectual disabilities and physical disabilities, um, people of certain ethnic groups. You know, that whole country still is in pain and mourning over that, over the fact that that happened. We suffer as a society when we hurt people who belong to it, who are different than us. However, when we do consider diversity, our culture benefits from multiple perspectives. And in the article that I had you read for tonight or for today, we talked about, or the article talked about how minority groups, ethnic minorities, are vastly underrepresented in our clinical trials. And the result of that is we don't necessarily have a good understanding of how some diseases work or how some medications treat some diseases. Um, Part of the reason we don't get good diverse samples is because we don't have diverse researchers. Most of the people, I think actually all of the people in this department are white, um, unless I'm forgetting someone. Most are men, that's for sure. Most of the people on this campus who are in positions of authority are white. And so when we don't have other perspectives, we forget. We don't consider the needs of minority groups or marginalized groups. And those groups don't necessarily trust that we have their best interests at heart. When we benefit from multiple perspectives, we begin to value the richness of human experience. We see that, oh, wait, people are different, and you know what? That's okay. I'm different than a lot of you, but I'm sure we all have some things in common. For example, I really love my family. I want to have kids one day. I want to get married one day. I like to watch Netflix and eat pizza and drink Diet Coke. And I think a lot of us, and you know, on a more personal level, there are days when I feel worthless and I feel sad and I feel unwanted and depressed. And all of us experience that. We're all very similar, but even though I have a different cultural experience and I live in a different way than a lot of people who are watching this do, we do all experience some of the same things. And if you have a rich experience, if you have multiple perspectives, you start to see that and it starts to rehumanize people who are different than ourselves. We also see people thrive and developmental trajectories better for every person. In countries where cultural differences are celebrated, the people there are much happier. Um, and that's a really good thing, and it's something that we should all strive for. And we reduce injustice and oppression. And I think that's one of the most important parts of considering diversity is that we are not hurting anyone by celebrating diverse perspectives. And everyone benefits from that. Not just the minority group, but the non-minority group also benefits. And so, well, it's important for us in this class and as a science to consider diversity, and we will be doing that a lot this semester. Now, one of the complaints I've gotten in the past, and I want to address it now before we move forward, is people say I like to use my lectures as a soapbox or that I get very political because I talk about diversity issues. And I will say it many times throughout the semester, and this is always my justification, but we have in our country and in our society politicized or made political people's identities and people's bodies. we say, well, the concerns of African Americans are just their opinion. They're not valid. We don't have to listen to them. And if they're trying to push it on us, that's infringing on our rights. Um, the reality is, though, that every person has every right to complain about their experience, to bring public um, awareness to their experiences, and to an effective way to silence people and to tell them that they don't have a right to do that is to make it political. And so when that happens, when we politicize people's bodies and people's identities, their development suffers. They are seriously affected by it, and it becomes immediately a developmental issue. And so I will talk about diverse issues in this class, and it will feel very political because we have politicized developmental issues. But I promise you, I'm not making a political statement. I'm simply talking about issues that affect people groups and how those issues affect them in negative and positive ways. And everything that I say, every point that I bring up is stuff that has either been studied by science or has been shared by people who identify to that group. If you want more information, I'm happy to send you all of the articles that I've read that gave me the knowledge that I have and that I'm trying to give to you. So if you feel that the class is too political because we're talking about diverse issues, then contact me and I'll send you all the articles so that you can read them and be as informed as I am, so that we're on the same page. Let's talk now about the different problems that arise as a result of not considering diversity from the perspective of our ethnic identities, our gender identities, and our sexual identities. So let's start with racism. Racism is comprised of two components. So the first is social power. And social power are privileges that exist legally or socially due to possessing certain physical characteristics, such as your skin color or your genitalia. So an example of social power is for the women on the recording who have ever been in a group with other men. Have you noticed that the men tend to talk over you, or that they don't listen to you, or that you contribute in ways that are not valued in the same way as if a man had done it? Well, that's social power. Social power is the value of your body and your identity in comparison to other people. And so people who are white have much more social power than people who are black or native or Asian, or Arab or Hispanic or Latino. And the reason for that is up until 50 years ago, it was legal in this country to separate people by their race. Just last week, we celebrated the anniversary of it being legal to marry someone of a different race or ethnicity than you. Let that sink in. In your grandparents' generation, a white person and a black person were not allowed to get married. I mean, that was like 50 years ago. 50 years ago. And so being white is still highly valued subconsciously in our minds because a lot of the people who live in our country today lived in a time when it was legal to separate people based on their race, to say only white people can use this bathroom, only people of color can use this bathroom, only white people can use this fountain, only people of color can use this fountain. We're going to have different schools, different universities. NDSU is a land grant university. And every state has one land grant university. But Alabama and all the southern states have two land grant universities because in the southern states, our schools were segregated by race. So Auburn University, where I got my undergrad degree, is a land grant university. It is the traditional white land grant university. Obviously, they admit students of color now, but it used to be that they didn't. In fact, we were the second university in Alabama to admit a black student. We were the only university in Alabama to admit that student without any opposition from the students and faculty. So that's something to be proud of. In fact, our students embraced that student when he came on campus for the first time. It was people from the community that were jerks about it. Alabama A&M, which is 3 hours north of Auburn, is the traditional historical black land-grant university. Auburn and Alabama A&M work together, though, on everything, and I think it's wonderful. But the fact that there are two land-grant universities in that state represent the fact that 50 years ago, it was still legal for us to be separate. And so you can't expect that this value of a white life over a black life um, will just go away in 50 years. It takes a long time. 50 years versus like hundreds of years of there being a clear, distinct value placed on one type of life over another. And that's the point of the whole Black Lives Matter movement, is to remind people that, yeah, black lives are also equally valid and their experiences are equally valid. But that's another discussion for another day. The second component of racism is race-based prejudice. And these are negative beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors about a person that's based solely on their ethnic identity. And so these are things like, well, all white people are racist and oppressive and would like to own slaves. That would be a race-based prejudice. Saying that all black people are, lazy and they don't do anything to contribute to society is an example of a race-based prejudice. And neither of those are okay. However, race-based prejudice on its own can only be perpetrated by people of color. In other words, black people, native people, Latinos, Arabs are the only people who can act out through race-based prejudice. And the targets of this prejudice can be white people or other people of color. On the other hand, racism, and we typically call any form of race-based prejudice racism, but racism is different. Racism is that race-based prejudice and social power. In other words, it's holding a prejudiced view and having the social power to make that hurt. So only white people can be the perpetuators of racism, or the perpetrators of racism, and only people of color can be on the receiving end of racism, because we still value white lives over the lives of people of color. And I know that's hard for a lot of people to process because we just use racism interchangeably with race-based prejudice. But think about it. When we call a person of color the N-word, that hurts, because that word comes with hundreds of years of slavery, of oppression, of segregation, of fear, of economic and academic bankruptcy, and us as a society blaming all the negative things about our cities, about our education system, about, you know, working class people on an entire race of people. So when you use the N-word, you're basically dredging up all of that pain, all of that grief. Now, if we were to be called crackers, most white people would probably not be, if we would be annoyed, we might be offended, but it's not going to carry with it the same sting, because we've never been enslaved. We've never been property. We've never been segregated. We've always had every advantage that we could possibly want or have access to, or even have the hope of having those different privileges. And so that's the difference. That's the difference between just being prejudiced, but also having the social power to legitimize and back up that prejudice. Racism has, throughout the years, taken many different forms, and probably the worst in our history as a country has been slavery. Um, when we dehumanize black lives, when we dehumanize native lives, when we dehumanize Asian lives and Arab lives and Muslim lives, this is what happens. We start using them as objects. We stop caring about their needs and their voices. And even though we don't have slavery today, we still have a history of violence against people of color who make any kind of attempt to reclaim their dignity and to claim their rightful place in society and their rights as a society. This is Representative John Lewis right here on the right. He was in the Selma marches, and the Alabama State Police literally beat up all of these black people and their white allies who were protesting against the lack of civil rights that they had in Alabama and in the United States. Today, we still see a trend of violence against people of color. Black people are the most likely of any individual people group to be killed by police. They are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. And the sad thing is that 30% of black victims were unarmed in 2015 compared to 19% of white victims. In other words, it's shoot first, ask questions later when it comes to a person of color, but when it comes to a white person, we usually can just ask a question. And this is really what motivates the Black Lives Matter movement is this slide right here, this statistic, the fact that even though white people commit more violent crimes, more black people get killed by police, and most of those, and a large percentage of those people are unarmed, and they don't deserve to be killed. They don't even deserve to be put in a position where they would be killed. And it's not about crime. Fewer than 1 in 3 black people killed by police in America this year were suspected of a violent crime and were allegedly armed. 69% were nonviolent and unarmed. Yet they're 3 times more likely to get killed by police. That's motivated entirely by racism, by this idea, this prejudice that's in our mind, this bias that's in our mind that tells us that there's something to be feared about people of color, that they're a risk, that they're a threat to our society. All of that comes from racism. It's not just when it comes to crime either. We have to think about economics and how that relates to identity as a person of color. 27.4% is the poverty rate of African Americans, and among all of racial and ethnic groups, African Americans have the highest poverty rate, followed by Hispanic or Latino people at 26.6% and white people at 9.9%. And almost half of black children under the age of 6 live in poverty compared to just 14.5% of white children. So this constant state of threat, this lack of economic stability that prevents people from moving forward in life, all of these things have a negative impact on the developmental outcomes of people of color. And we don't consider this. We try to put them on the same playing field as white people and say, well, they can go to school, they can go to college, they can get a good job. It's all on them to do better. When the reality is, they've only had 50 years to catch up to us, and it's not fair. But this belief and the outcomes associated with these beliefs are all motivated by racism. Let's talk about our native friends and family and siblings and neighbors. Um, when I moved to North Dakota, I met probably the most Native people that I've ever known in my life, and that's because in the South there aren't a lot of Native Americans. The reason for that is the Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson ordered all Native people in the Southeast to go west, and they did. And there are very small pockets of Native people groups in Alabama and in Georgia and in Florida. And so you could pretty much go anywhere in Alabama and you probably will not ever encounter a Native person. And that's really sad. And it was sad for me. So like most Americans, have some Native people in my ancestry, and my great great grandmother was a Muskogee member of the Muskogee Nation or the Creek Nation in Alabama, and she married my great great grandfather, who was white, and was able to stay in East Alabama when the rest of her community was shipped off to Oklahoma. And I later looked up the Muskogee Nation in Oklahoma because I wanted to see what had happened to them. And if you look at their reservation, all of the city names or town names or community names are identical to communities in East Alabama, or in other parts of Alabama where the Muskogee Nation resided. And when I saw that, it was very hard for me to process because you think about all of these people who had to leave land that was theirs, a country that meant something to them, go to this strange place, and all they wanted was to recreate it, and they did by recreating the town names. And it's hard. It's hard to think about. Um, and I there are things about Alabama that I hate, but I love Alabama, and it's my home, and it's always going to always be the most beautiful and perfect place for me because it's where I grew up, and I'm sure many people in North Dakota feel the same way. you know, there are things about North Dakota you probably dislike, but you'll always love North Dakota because it's your home, and that's normal, and that's perfect, and that's right. We have to think about our native neighbors and our native compatriots who this is their land. Their people have been here longer than we have, and it's been taken from them. And the pain of that doesn't go away. We have native people in North Dakota, but a lot of the places where they live, their reservations are not the land where their people were from originally. There was land that the white settlers didn't want, that the government set up for use by the natives, and they said, okay, you have to go there now and live there. And our dislike and our vile and hateful rhetoric against native people have led to a lot of atrocities. This is a picture of the Battle of Wounded Knee, and um, we literally slaughtered thousands of natives and just like chucked them in the ground, and it was like, okay, now we can have the land, we can use it, we can settle this land, these Dakotas for our own purposes. And it's sad because later the Nazis would use our tactics against the Native Americans, our method of moving in quickly and disarming them and slaughtering them. They would use that to inspire the Holocaust. And the sad thing is that we still do this today. Um, we may not we may not murder natives en masse, but we definitely insult them on a daily basis. I mean, look at this sports mascot. We have a caricature here of a native person, and we caricaturize. I mean, think about the Fighting Sioux. The Lakota people. That's what they're called. Lakota, Nakota, Dakota. Sioux is a French word given to them. It's not necessarily a way that they identify. Um, and here we are in the state of North Dakota that belonged once to this group of people, and our mascot for one of our football teams used to be the Fighting Sioux, and there's still a debate over this, and it's a debate over whether or not the complaint is legitimate. But here we are, trivializing and making fun of to a degree an entire people group that we have slaughtered and marginalized and relegated to poverty. And it continues. The Redskins in Washington are another example of that. Redskin is a pejorative term for Native Americans, but people say, well, it's just a team. It's our team, and we're honoring them by giving them, by having them as our mascot. And it's like, I think they'd rather be honored by you, like treating them with respect instead of like using a pejorative term. I mean, a comparison would be to have a very white face on this guy with a man bun instead of a feather and call it the, you know, genocidal slaughterhouse or something. Like, we would be offended by that, and rightly so, because it's not appropriate to say, even though it could be true in some regards. But we see this cultural appropriation all the time. We turn Native American outfits, their sacred headdresses, their sacred outfits, into costumes that we use for Halloween or for other such occasions. We completely trivialize the experience and the culture of these people, and we forget that this culture has been taken from them. Um, in our history in the United States, we had these things called boarding schools, and they were literal boarding schools where Native children were sent to be made white, essentially. They would go, their hair would be cut, they would be harshly punished if they spoke in their native language. They had to speak English, they had to convert to Catholicism or some other Christian religion. And the result is most native languages don't have very many native speakers. Recently, I can't remember which language it was, but the last native speaker of this language died. And so that language is lost in some regards because only native speakers can truly appreciate the nuance of a language. And it's gone forever, but there are people living on reservations here in North Dakota who can't speak their native language, who can't speak the language of their ancestors. And language means a lot to us. Language defines a lot of who we are. And so it's very hard for people and people groups to move beyond this loss, to move beyond um, this disconnection with their very core cultural identity. And we still, react violently to natives when they speak out against oppression. I mean, the perfect example happened just south of Bismarck over the summer with the Standing Rock protests. The Standing Rock Nation was very justified in their concerns about the Dakota Access Pipeline. People protested, and literally, and court documents that keep coming out are demonstrating this full well, that military tactics were used against unarmed civilians who were resisting and protesting against something that they thought was unjust. By comparison, last year and the year before, white militants and who were armed, white people who were armed, um, occupied federal lands in protest of the fact that they had to pay a fee to graze their cattle there. This happened in Oregon and it also happened in Nevada. And nothing happened. There was no armed reaction to that. The police just kind of stood there and let them do it. And it even got to the point where these militants were patrolling the streets and they were asking people to identify themselves. They weren't legal law enforcement agents, but they had guns and they were intimidating. But they were white, and so they were fine and nobody got hurt. Well, someone did get killed in Oregon, but he did try to shoot a police officer. But again, this difference in the way that we respond to insurrection, to protesting, is based on our racist assumption that the concerns of Native people are not justified. That they're somehow entitled and live off of the system, when the reality is the reason they have reservations, the reason they have an entire government agency devoted to um, managing the reservation system and the benefits that they get because they're native are the result of a treaty that the U.S. signed with all these different native groups saying, okay, you give us the United States and we'll make sure that you have a little bit of it that you can live on and we'll give you a little bit of money. And it's not a lot and it's not good. If you've ever been to a reservation, it's not like a resort. It's just some of the poorest parts of our country. It's almost like a third world country in the middle of our country. Um, the vast food deserts, not which means there's not a lot of access to food um, or to quality food, and isolation, and the results are not good. The developmental outcomes of Native people are not good because of the experiences that they've had historically and the experiences that they still have as a result of our racist attitudes against them. And then we think about atrocities like the Holocaust, where we have white supremacy reacting to Judaism to LGBT identity to um, other religious practices like Jehovah's Witness and other practices like that. Um, Slavic people, Russians, um, where people were carted up into these, I mean, I hate to say it, slaughterhouses, and they were literally worked to death, and then when they couldn't work anymore, were gassed, and then burned, and then thrown into a hole in the ground, and forgotten. And this was after their entire life, their home, their business, everything was stolen from them, plundered by the Nazis. This is an atrocity committed against millions of people, and it's because Jewish identity, LGBT identity, all these other identities were dehumanized, and it became okay to steal from them, and it became okay to exterminate them. Um, and we see religious persecution, we see cultural persecution like this all the time, even today. This man is a Muslim, and he was attacked um, just because he was going to mosque. He was attacked by two white people in New York, of all places. Was in serious condition for a while. He didn't do anything. He didn't provoke anyone, but because he's Muslim, he was attacked. Jewish cemeteries across the country are getting vandalized. We've seen a rise in anti-Semitism since November. It's because we have a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment going around right now. Um, this experience can have a very negative impact on people who identify as Jewish and people who identify as Muslim or people of other minority religious status. The fear of this sort of thing happening again, the fear of having your dignity stripped from you, having your possessions stripped from you, having your family and your loved ones stripped from you, can cause a lot of stress and anxiety that can have negative impacts on your psychological well-being as well as your physical well-being. And then, of course, we have this charming gentleman who was motivated by racism and by racial supremacy to kill unarmed black people in their church. So even Christians aren't safe in this situation if they're black or if they're not white um, in some other way, because this person used his white supremacy, used his racism as a motive, as an excuse for killing people who were praying and worshiping in peace. Um, that that fear also causes anxiety. It causes stress. I mean, imagine going to that church and having to go to church the next Sunday and knowing that your pastor and many of the people that you cared about had been killed in that building. Um, it and killed by someone who had been coming to services and had been like vetting this place before he went in and killed them. Like, can you imagine how scary it must be to go to that church and wonder if other people are just doing the same thing? I mean, that suddenly people may not want to go to church anymore. People may not want to associate with people who are different, who they don't know anymore, and that leads to isolation and can lead to worse social and psychological outcomes. So, again, racism has a very negative impact on not just people of color and other minorities, ethnic and racial minorities. It also has a negative impact on people like Dylan Roof, who was turned into this monster who killed a bunch of innocent people because of this hatred that ate away at him in his heart. Let's move away from sexism or racism and talk about sexism. Sexism combines and sex and gender-based prejudice, so negative beliefs about attitudes or behaviors about a person based solely on their gender identity, that should say, not ethnic identity. So, in other words, it's like race-based prejudice, except you substitute sex and gender for race. And so we have negative beliefs about someone because of their sex or their gender identity. And that is becomes a prejudice. And so that is sex or gender-based prejudice. And so anyone can perpetrate this, and anyone can be the target of it. Sexism, though, like racism, is the combination of this prejudice and the social power to back it up. And so, for this reason, only men can be sexist, and only women can be victims to sexism. And sexism throughout the years has been very violent against women. So we see here in this ad, this is a humorous, I don't know if it was an ad or a cartoon. This is violence. This woman is being physically restrained and her mouth is being locked shut and she's crying. This is violence against women and it's supposed to be funny and we laugh at it. But the reality is there are people who hold the view that the world would be a better place if women were silent, if women had their mouths closed, either because they're afraid to open them or because they've been restrained. And this leads to this idea and this notion that's perpetuated in our society that 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 women somehow are annoying, that they don't have a right to they express their opinion, that women who do express their opinions are troublemakers, and that women exist only for the amusement and pleasure of men. And here's another example. This is a modern day ad. Um, Obviously, they're making some kind of sexual association here, Burger King. And again, this woman is being used as an object. She's not a person. She doesn't have an identity. She doesn't have any rights. She is literally being used to sell whatever that disgusting looking burger is by use of a sort of a sexual, um, like an underhanded or subtle sexual reference. And that's not okay. Because women are more than just sexual objects, they're more than just masturbatory aids, but they can sell a burger by making it look like they're about to give a blowjob. And this attitude that women are sexual objects leads to people like Brock Turner, the former Sanford swimmer who, his freshman year of college, raped an unconscious girl behind a bar in an alley and was caught doing it and only served 3 months in prison because the judge thought that prison would be too hard for him. 3 months in prison, caught in the act of raping an unconscious woman. It's it's disgusting. It's inconceivable that we live in such a society where this kind of thing would happen. But the reality is, it does happen. Women are very much vulnerable in society, and statistics don't lie. Almost half of college age men say they would rape someone if they could get away with it. That that is especially terrifying when you think about the fact that we spend a large part of our day on college campuses surrounded by men. There's a television show called The Fall, and it's about a man who raped women and then murdered them. It's very, very gory, but it does highlight the way that misogyny and sexism combined really do have negative impacts on the lives of women. But the main character said that she'd interviewed a lot of women and a lot of men, and the one thing that men had said that they were the most afraid of was a woman laughing at them. Whereas the one thing women are afraid of when it comes to men is that men will kill them. And the reality is that's a pretty valid concern when you think about the fact that we live in a society where women are objectified. They're turned into sexual objects that exist only for the pleasure of men. And whether or not we believe that to be true, it does in fact exist and it does in fact happen. You just have to look at advertisements. You have to look at the way that women are talked about. I mean, the fact that no women at all are making any of the healthcare decisions in this country speaks a lot about how we value women's bodies and women's identities. And when you're being told over and over and over again that your identity doesn't matter, that your body doesn't matter, that you have no control over it, that it's okay for someone like Brock Turner to rape you and then get away with it, even though they were caught, is disgusting. I paused for a minute because I get CNN alerts on my phone, and apparently, Bill Cosby's on trial right now for all these assaults against women, and the jurors can't reach a unanimous decision. Like 30 women have come forward accusing him of the same thing, a lot of whom don't have anything to gain from it. It's like we don't believe women. We don't care what a woman has to say. And men can get away with using and abusing women because we don't care what women have to say. And you have to think about the impact that that can have on a person to be told over and over again, you don't matter. And it just gets even better. I remember this lovely piece of news coming across my desk where even women do this to each other. Where women internalize these messages of vile hatred against them and then they perpetuate the same violence against each other. This mom delivering her young daughter to jail to be a sex slave, or to a motel to be a sex slave. It's disgusting. It's horrible, but it happened. And it happens every day. A lot of the times, we have a really bad problem with sex trafficking in North Dakota. The people who perpetuate this sex trafficking, a lot of times, are women. Because women trust other women. They think they can trust other women. And so a woman is a lot of times used in sex trafficking cases to make someone comfortable enough so they can be kidnapped. And it's all because we've internalized this message that we're not anything better than objects to be used. The last thing I want to talk about before we move into ethics is anti-LGBTQ attitudes. And this includes homophobia or negative attitudes and beliefs about same-sex romantic or sexual attraction, biphobia, the belief that attraction to both or multiple sexes is not real, and transphobia, negative attitudes and beliefs about transgender identity. And this manifests itself in so many different ways. I mean, we think of the classic Westboro Baptist Church, God hates fags signs, but it also manifests itself in this split rail fence in Wyoming where Matthew Shepard was tied and then beat to death because he was gay. And that happens all the time. It doesn't just happen sporadically, it does happen a lot. People are victimized for being gay or being transgender. Um, or being bisexual, or being any other form of minority sexuality or gender identity. Today in our society, we have this debate ongoing about whether or not transgender people have the right to use the bathroom that affirms their gender identity. And I think this picture sums up full well the sort of the frustrating part of, or frustrating part of this argument that either way, trans people lose. You either get yelled at for using the bathroom that you feel comfortable in, or you get beat up for using the bathroom that you don't feel comfortable in, or vice versa. You get yelled at if you use the bathroom that that society says you should use, or you get beat up if you try to use the bathroom that affirms your gender identity. Um, we don't think about the fact that trans people are human beings who just need to use the bathroom and who are much more vulnerable and much more likely to get hurt than anybody else who's using the bathroom. And when we think about transgender life and we think about the violence that they experience, 41% don't change their gender on their identification documents, and they can't because they can't afford the surgeries. 57% are rejected by their families. 19% have experienced homelessness. 19% are refused medical care, and 47% will attempt suicide in their lifetime. And this is because of the violent rhetoric and the violence against transgender people. And well, we've talked about a little bit today, and we'll talk about in the future how transgender identity is normal. It's just a normal part of human expression. But almost half of the people in this community have bad experiences because of their gender identity. And so you think about that, and you have to think about how that impacts a trans person's life, how that impacts, similar experiences for gay and lesbian and bisexual people impact their development, impact their mental health, impact their physical health, impact their social relationships. And it's hard to justify sort of this notion that people can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and if they work hard enough and they are good enough, like smart enough and successful enough, that they'll be fine in life. The reality is our experiences, our social experiences, our cultural experiences, based on our sexuality, our gender, and our ethnicity, impact in very real ways the ways that we are allowed to develop and the ways that we're allowed to experience our education and our success. Just on Monday, we remembered and had the first anniversary of the Orlando nightclub attack, the Pulse attack that occurred last year, where 40 or so LGBT people, mostly Latinx people, were gunned down by a person who, as it turns out, was gay himself, but who, because of the violent rhetoric against LGBT people, because of the negative attitudes in his community about LGBT identity, had so much internalized hatred for himself that he killed all of these people. And everyone, I can speak because I am a member of this community, everyone in the community felt this very hard because nightclubs are, especially gay nightclubs, are some of the few places where we can be ourselves, we can feel accepted, and to have this done to us puts us in a vulnerable place. And literally, the Saturday after this, I was in Bismarck at Capitol Pride, and I was really nervous. I was worried there would be some kind of similar attack. And there were other Pride celebrations across the country where that was also felt. And I sat through a meeting for another Pride where we were discussing how we were going to protect people in the event of some kind of emergency, and we had to come up with a special system of code so that we could communicate with each other to keep people safe. And the stress of that, if you have to live under that every day, can be incredibly detrimental to your health, and it can make you feel really bad. And it puts you in a less equal footing with other people. If you've never had to worry about this, you're definitely much luckier than if you have um, had to worry about it. So what kind of outcomes can people expect if they belong to a minority group? Well, the highest mortality rate of any minority group, or any group at all, is African Americans. They have a horrible rate of early death. In terms of education outcomes, Latino Americans or Latinx Americans have the worst educational outcomes. Transgender Americans have the worst mental health, and Native Americans have the worst overall physical health. Now, why is that? Is there something implicit or intrinsic about having one of these minority statuses and having these outcomes? Well, the reality is that these populations have these negative outcomes because our have these worse outcomes have these outcomes because when you experience all of these horrible negative things in your lifetime, it does have a negative impact on the way that you develop. And so as we move forward in our class, we'll be talking about different developmental outcomes for different groups and how they potentially could be affected by the minority status of that individual. So I want you to think about that. Be mindful of that as we go forward and as we read about different developmental principles and theories. How would those be different? How would those outcomes be different if the identity of the person was different than what we would think of as sort of being the norm or white? So a lot of what we read will be based on statistics for white people. And so I want you to think about as we move forward. So white, straight people, I should say, white, straight, and cisgender people. So I want you to think about as we move forward how those outcomes may be different for another people group. And the reality is, as a nurse, as a doctor, as a therapist, as a social worker, as a teacher, you are going to be working with minority groups, and I want you to be prepared for what you have to for what you're going to have to experience and prepared for treating them differently, not in the way that you are treating them socially, but treating them in terms of the treatment that you're giving them or the educational practice that you're using, because you're going to have to be able to adapt the thing that you're doing to meet their very specific different needs. So if you have any questions about that, please let me know. So let's move into ethics now. Our current ethical practices in psychology came about as a result of some pretty horrible things that happened in our history. So the Tuskegee syphilis study in the 30s is an example of a really horrible study that perpetuated a lot of negative, unethical things. And essentially what happened, Tuskegee is a town in Alabama. It's actually 20 minutes from Auburn where I grew up. I've been to Tuskegee many times. But what happened is there is a high rate of syphilis in that community. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease, and if untreated, can kill you. And actually, it's a very horrible way to go. But it's fortunately easy to treat with penicillin or any other antibiotic. And so, what the U.S. Department of Health decided to do is like we're going to look at the effects of syphilis on the human body if left untreated. And so they got all these people from Tuskegee with syphilis to participate in their study, and they just watched them and they observed them for a period of 40 years, and they told them that there wasn't a treatment for it. But the reality was this treatment was discovered about halfway through the study, but they didn't give them the penicillin. And a lot of these people died or suffered severe physical deformity and severe physical disability as a result of not being given penicillin. And this has led to a lot of distrustment of white people and a lot of distrustment of science and of doctors in this community. This community still is impacted by this, even though it's been been almost 50 years since it happened. In the 40s, in Nazi Germany, physicians employed by the Nazi regime did experiments um, on um, on many different types of people, on people with learning disabilities, on people who were LGBT, on Jewish people. Um, in one notable experiment, they put a bunch of prisoners, so it could be Jews, it could be LGBT people, it could be anyone that they interned, put them into a chamber that was refrigerated, drop the temperature way down, and then douse them in water because they wanted to see how long a human being could survive in those conditions. And they were doing it to benefit their soldiers so that they could see like how long it would take them to, um, freeze to death. Um, in terms of psychology, though, it wasn't until the 60s that we really started to notice some pretty unethical. I mean, there are plenty of unethical stuff before this, but I mean these two studies, the Milgram obedience study and the Stanford prison experiment, really pushed us to come to terms with the fact that as a science, we had a long way to go ethically. The Milgram obedience study was actually a reaction to the Nazi regime in World War II. A German philosopher named Hannah Arendt wrote this paper about the banality of evil because she was a Jewish woman, Jewish German woman survived um, who survived the Holocaust. She escaped from a camp and made it to the U.S. And she went to this war criminal trial in Jerusalem of this man who was in charge of the division of the Nazi government that was responsible for transportation of prisoners to the death camps. And so she saw that this man did not appear to be evil, and his defense was, "I just did what I was told to do. I was told to do it by someone in authority. You couldn't disobey. I just did it because I was told to do it. But I don't have anything against Jews. I don't care about I didn't really believe any of what I was doing. I just did it because that was what I was told to do." And so she proposed that most people do evil things not because they're evil, but because they don't think about what they're doing, or they don't think about the bigger picture, or because a person in authority is just telling them to do it. So Stanley Milgram, a psychologist, read this paper and was like, "This is really interesting. I want to experiment. I want to test empirically if this is in fact true." And so what he did is he had these people come into his lab and he brought them into a room with a control panel with these knobs and dials and little voltmeters. And he said, on the other side of this wall is another person, and they're going to be um, doing you're going to be reading something to them, and they have to read it back to you. And if they get it wrong, then you'll shock them, and you'll just do that by switching this knob right here. But don't go. You're going to go here to this amount. But I'll let you know, and if they continue to get it wrong, we may have to increase the shock, the electrical shock. And so, unbeknownst to them, the person on the other side of the wall was actually another researcher. They weren't another participant. They were just somebody else who'd been recruited or they were somebody who was working on the study. And they weren't actually hooked up to anything. And their goal, the person who was on the other side of the wall, was to get everything wrong so the person had to shock them. And so what would happen is they would get things wrong, and research participant, would shock them. And then after a while, the researcher would say, "Well, we're going to increase the voltage." And they kept increasing the voltage till the little dial went to this little red danger zone area, and the person still continued to shock the other person because this person in a lab coat was telling them it was okay to do it. And the participants actually suffered severe, like, psychological breakdowns as a result of being in the study because it was hard for them to hurt someone. And actually, as the knob would get or the dial would get higher and higher, the person would start pleading for them to stop, and then they would say, "I'm having a heart attack," or they would make like these sounds like they were having a heart attack, and then they would fall silent. They wouldn't respond, and the person was still shocking them. And what Milgram found is that people will do horrible things if someone in authority tells them to do it. And this supported Hannah Arendt's original philosophy that most evil acts are committed by people who don't think about the implication of what they're doing. The Stanford prison experiment was done by a student of Milgram, Zimbardo, who was interested in looking at the way that people are corrupted by power. And so what they did, these students at Stanford signed up for this experiment, and then they were randomly arrested by these fake police. They didn't realize that this was a study. They were randomly arrested, and they were put into this prison that was built in the basement of the psychology department at Stanford. And some of the participants were made jailers, and others were made prisoners. And they found over time that things completely broke down, that people who were in positions of authority they were doing horrible things to prisoners. They were abusing them because they were in control. And what he found is that absolute power corrupts absolutely, which is something we've always thought. In fact, this experiment was so bad and it was so unethical that Stanford canceled it after only a couple days because they were worried about the safety of the people who were the prisoners. From these studies and from these horrible things that happened, there came a series of changes in the way that we do research. The Nuremberg trials in the 40s, so 1945 to 1946, were the war crimes trials of many of the Nazi doctors and scientists, and they highlighted some of the horrible things that had happened. The public really wasn't as aware of what had gone on in Nazi Germany in terms of medical research until the Nuremberg trials, and these basically highlighted the need for understanding understanding how we can prevent the horrible things that happened during the Nazi era from happening again in terms of people participating in research. And in the 70s, in 1978, the Belmont Report came out in the United States, which highlighted the three key components of ethics for research with human beings. And the first is respect for persons. We have to respect the dignity of people. We have to recognize that people are free to make decisions for themselves. They're free um, to be informed and to be treated like adults when it comes to research. They're not just gonna. They can't just be. You can't just have a person come in and do whatever you want to them. You have to protect them. The second is beneficence, and that is that whatever you do has to have some kind of benefit to the person who's receiving it. You know, most of the time we just compensate people for their participation, and that's not good enough. Beneficence goes beyond just giving them money. You can give people money and then do horrible things to them. Beneficence is you are not hurting them in any way. You're not putting them in a position where they could be hurt in a way that would not normally happen to them in everyday life. The last is justice. Everyone should be treated the same, should be treated fairly, and there should be a just reason for doing the research. From the Belmont Report, we get institutional review boards, and these are committees at universities and other research institutions like hospitals that are designed to protect the public from unethical research. They're comprised of other scientists, an independent member from the community, and all they do is review applications for studies that are going to be conducted at that institution, and they approve the ones that are ethical. And if they aren't ethical, or they have something wrong with them, then the board will make recommendations, and the person just has to alter the study a little bit to make it ethical, and then they resubmit it. But the institutional review board exists to make sure that things like the Stanford study, the Milgram study, don't happen again. Within our ethical understanding of research, there are many different elements that have to be in play for something to be considered ethical. The first is protection from harm. So physical and psychological discomfort has to be minimized. You can make people uncomfortable, but it can't be something above and beyond what would be reasonably expected for a person to experience on a day-to-day basis. The benefit must outweigh the harm. So there has to be some kind of benefit that justifies the level of harm that they're being put in. Data should be collected always using the safest possible method, and if there's any intentional harm or that occurs or is likely to occur, the experiment has to be discontinued and altered. Um, Privacy is a second element. We have to maintain the confidentiality of the material, of the data collected, of the person participating, both before, during, and after the experiment. Knowledge of the results. Participants must be able to have access to the findings of the study. They can't just participate and then never know what happened. You have to publish your results in some way. Um, the next element is beneficial treatments. All participants must be given the same benefits, even those in the control group. So in other words, you can't say, I'm going to give this experimental drug to the experimental group and the control group just gets a sugar pill. Now, you can do that. You can do that in your experiment, but after it's over, you have to give the control group the option of doing the experimental drug after the fact. So you can't just give benefit to some, everyone has to be involved, and that's part of the justice component of the Belmont Report. Informed consent is another ethical element. All participants must be fully informed of the experimental method, the outcomes, the risk, and the benefits to the study. You have to tell people beforehand what they're getting themselves into. Now, You can, in some very rare circumstances, use deception. So if knowing all of the things that are happening in the study would potentially affect your ability to get non-biased results, you can deceive the person if and only if the deception does not put them in undue harm, psychological or physical. But you have to get permission from the IRB to use deception, and you have to debrief. You have to tell the participant exactly what you deceived them on and why it was necessary once it's over. Additionally, within informed consent, special care needs to be made with vulnerable participants. So children give assent. They cannot consent to participate because they're not old enough, but they do give assent. You ask them, do you want to do this? If they say no, even if their parents said they could, if they say no, I don't want to do it, you cannot do it. And then elderly people and prisoners also. You just have to, with elderly people, sometimes you have to get consent from their legal guardian if they are under the care of a legal guardian. But you should still, regardless of whether or not they can give consent, um, make sure that you're taking special care to not take advantage of them because they're vulnerable. And prisoners are also that way. We have to be careful that we don't allow prisoners to become lab rats because they are locked away from society. So you have to be very careful when you're working with prisoners. All right, for your discussion for today for Class 3, so subject for this discussion board would be Class 3. I want you to read the following information and I want you to answer the question. Dr. Maleficence wants to know what the effect of blasting loud music repetitively for 48 hours in an enclosed space has on human determination. He tells his participants, prisoners serving a life sentence, that they will be freed if they can stay in their unlocked jail cells for 72 hours. After 48 hours of playing Justin Bieber's Baby, he noticed that most of the participants are still in their cells. So he cranks the thermostat down to 20 degrees and turns on the sprinkler system. At the end of the experiment, the jailers unlock the cells and no one is freed. What ethical principles, if any, are violated? So I'll leave this up. Read it, make notes. You can pause it, I suppose, and do the discussion board and answer it. And answer the question, what ethical principles, if any, are violated? All right, thank you so much for participating today in class. I enjoyed our talk. For tomorrow, read pages 45 to 75 and think about the following. What are some of the ways my biology makeup and environment have impacted my development? We will be talking about biology and environmental contributions to development. Remember, you can always come see me or call me if you need to talk about what we discussed today. I will be in my office until about 11:50. I need to leave a little early today. I will be in my office tomorrow, though, during the normal office hours. Remember that the Tell Me About You survey is due tomorrow at 11:59 p.m. and your quiz will be available for you to take tomorrow as well. So just remember all that. Let me know if you need me. Email is darcy.corbett, CORBITTHALL @ndsu.edu. And my phone number again is 701 630 6838. 701 630 6838. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you tomorrow.